Today we're going to be looking at the Wave, a heavy-duty tandem-capable model from Silvercross. Please note that this is the 2020 version, and while there are reviewers out there who receive advanced models in order to promote the brand, that's not us. That being said, the updates made between the 2020 and 2021 versions are relatively small, mostly being little tweaks to size and weight, and we'll be sure to point out any of the changes that we feel are relevant as we go along. One other thing I want to say as well before we get into this review proper is that if you've been researching this model online a bit already, then you've probably come across a lot of terms like heritage and heirloom and making strollers since 1877 and all that, because that sort of thing seems to be the company's byline, which is all well and good when we're talking about their heritage collection, but as far as the rest of their strollers go, my basic opinion is that proud old companies like Silvercross generally ought to concern themselves more with living up to their heritage rather than living off of it. What I mean by this is that we won't be giving extra credit for any of that historical stuff today. Rather, the Wave is going to have to hold its own in terms of how comfortable it is for children and parents alike, its mechanical attributes, and what roles it fulfills in comparison to the larger market. So let's get started then, beginning with some stats. The Silvercross Wave, the 2021 version, clocks in at around 12 kilos in its lightest mono configuration, and folds down to 94 by 58 by 38 centimeters. It can take 25 kilos in the seat, and supposedly around 15 kilos in the underslung shopping basket. Starting off with child comfort, the Wave's maiden seat is, unfortunately, very much on the small side in comparison to similar models, both in terms of width and length, and will be most comfortable for children under 2.5 or so, in my opinion. It will still fit children older than this as well, but the width is likely to get a bit cramped, and the leg support will eventually become insufficient. As far as the textiles are concerned, the quality is generally decent for a premium model. Not as wowie-kazowie to me as a lot of reviewers like to claim, with all the leather and shiny details, but then, to each his own. A seat liner is included in the basic package, as well as a storm cover, if you're getting the older pre-2021 version. But the one thing that's strangely not included is shoulder pads, at least on the 2020 version, though we can't find any confirmation as to whether they will come with the 2021 model either. It is possible to remove the textiles for a wash, though it's worth noting that the process is a tad on the difficult side. As far as the canopy is concerned, the Wave has a sun flap for providing extra coverage, which has become somewhat of an old-school method at this point, but which is quite nicely formed in my opinion. In general then, my primary disappointment with the seat is the size, and otherwise, it's mostly okay, though I'd like to note that the frame itself is a little fiddly to attach to the chassis, due to somewhat weakly made seat struts that struggle to find their correct position simultaneously. But then again, making up for these negatives on the other hand, is the fact that this is the only model I'm aware of that makes sure you know it's approved for smokers, so there is that. As far as parent comfort and ease of use are concerned, I'd say that the defining feeling of using the Wave is its size. It feels bulky, like driving a tank, and I mean even when you're using it as a one-child model. The 2021 version has been downsized by a couple centimeters, but from what I've seen, it's not a very noticeable difference, and accompanying and contributing to this feeling of bulk come both pluses and minuses. On the positive side, the model offers a good range with its handle height and has decently spacious and accessible shopping basket, as well as offering one of my favorite stroller characteristics in the form of a higher than average seat position achieved by flipping up the central adapters, regardless of whether you're using the tandem mode. Negatively, the model's chunkiness makes it a bit difficult to carry and pack away. Folding is easy enough though, and also impacts driving, in particular when one takes into account a few other mechanical factors that we'll deal with later, that make the model feel stiff and relatively unsuspended. The Wave is no off-road champion, you see, despite its size, and this, coupled with the small seat, really sort of makes purchasing the model a double or bust type of situation in my opinion. It has value for 2 children, but as a single-child model, it's easily outstripped by most of the competition. Please note also, however, that the heavy, bulky feeling when driving, in particular when it comes to steering and tipping, will be increased quite significantly in the tandem configuration, since this is a front-loaded model. Okay, we're going to move on and look at the mechanics of the Wave then, starting off with the handle, the folding system, and the general structure of the model. And to start with, I just want to point out that the structure of the chassis is pretty sturdy, with good overall horizontal support, especially because Silvercross has utilized the shopping basket frame to contribute more significantly structurally than a lot of manufacturers do. But that being said, there are 3 elements that bother me quite a lot with the model. First being the incredible creakiness of the handle right out of the box, which, in addition to being annoying, indicates looseness in the connection points, in particular around the handle extension mechanism. And since there have been reports of occasional problems with height adjustment, my concern is that the internal components may not be fitted as tightly as they ought to be. The second thing that bothers me is the shape of the bars, the fact that they're big fat round tubes, which is inefficient in comparison to using thinner angular bars specifically oriented to mitigate horizontal or vertical vibrations and pressure stresses from driving, steering, and tipping, as pretty much everyone else on the top end of the market does. I'm not saying that the model's round bars are weak, mind you, I just don't quite get why they've gone to all the trouble of using magnesium alloy to reduce weight, while at the same time not taking advantage of other, clearly more efficient industry developments. The last thing that bothers me here, which is also the most serious in my opinion, is the sort of mechanism they've employed for the model's fold, which to start with uses quite long internal wires to get from the activation triggers all the way down to the locking point near the front frames, but then which triggers a sort of mechanism commonly employed on hinged handles, a pair of discs that rotate independently of each other when unlocked, with spring-loaded internal components that shoot out from one side to lock the other. This is a problematic sort of mechanism in my experience, which is one of the reasons that most strollers have switched to telescopic handles. And to use such a system in these proportions, riveted and thus not disassemblable, for something as important as a stroller's folding mechanism is just baffling to me. The mechanisms themselves are placed in a well-supported position, so it's impossible to say that they will necessarily fail, barring accidents, but still, the potential for wear and alignment problems down the road which may make it impossible for people to fold the stroller at all, especially with the sort of weight this model is expected to take, is very high. Okay, moving down to the rear frame then, the first thing I want to point out is the suspension, because as I said earlier, the model does generally feel stiff and unsuspended, and looking at the size of the suspension hinges, it might be difficult to understand why this is. But what I'd like to point out is that in order to get a real feeling of bouncy suspension with models in these proportions, intended to bear such heavy loads, manufacturers really have to use the suspension as a central hub, around which the rest of the chassis is constructed, like for example, the suspension struts on the Upper Baby Vista, or the central suspension unit on the Stokke Trails, both of which make the suspended feeling of the rear end a big part about how the model feels to push, while the wave suspension, unfortunately, feels a bit more like an afterthought. Moving on to the brake system, the unfortunate stream of bad design choices continues, with a spring-loaded wire-based setup where the wire itself is actually exposed, being mounted in the open on the underside of the rear crossbar, and thus is highly susceptible at the ends to rust and grit from puddles or snow or winter road salt getting in, and potentially stopping up the system entirely in the long run. Lastly, I'd also like to make a quick note on the rear wheels, where Silvercross has elected to go for the common setup of mounting the locking mechanisms within the axles. From many years' experience, and while there are a lot of good brands that do this, I can tell you that this setup is prone to problems resulting either from rust or more commonly from the axles bending as a result of weight. And remember that fully loaded in the tandem configuration, this model is apt to get quite heavy. And the resulting effect in such cases is that it usually becomes either impossible to retract the locking mechanisms and remove the wheels, or, if you do get them off, to get them to lock it in place again, thus necessitating replacement. Okay, we're going to finish off by looking at the front end of the model, where the Wave actually checks off most of the boxes on my list of what's acceptable, with decent fork suspension, good swivel locks, and front wheel size that, though they seem small in relation to the rest of the model, are actually not too bad with regards to the rest of the market. When it comes to the potential for developing wobbling problems down the road, however, which results from a loosening between the front forks of the housing over time due to wear, I do have some concerns with the Wave, both because the forks are relatively loose right out of the box, but also because, though it would seem that several elements in this connection point are there to prevent loosening, the way it's all put together is wrong. So then, while having the axles protrude from the stroller as opposed to up from the forks is good, because it means that potential problems are consigned to the forks as opposed to the chassis, the locking notches are far too high up on the axles, which negates any potential support from the plastic rings located just above those notches. And secondly, though there are ball bearings in the forks, which should have secured a perfectly tight connection here at least while the model is new, the bearings are set to be flush with those plastic rings as opposed to the axles, and since the rings are not long enough and are made of plastic, the connection is insufficiently tight to prevent looseness and wear. For these reasons then, and given that the wheels sit a bit loose from the very beginning, I strongly suspect this as a model that will develop wobble problems down the road. So, should you get the Silvercross Wave then? No. It's not my ideal choice anyway, certainly not for the price. In my opinion, there are unfortunately simply too many poor choices in the overall design that make the model feel heavy, stiff, bulky, and creaky, and that fail to maximize either child comfort, terrain capability, or longevity. And on today's market, whether you're looking for a one-child model that will eventually quote-unquote grow with your family, or whether you're looking for a two-child setup from the get-go, there are simply better options. In any case, we hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, we ask that you subscribe, as it helps us to continue making videos in the future. In addition, if you are currently shopping for a stroller, we have a buyer's guide on our Patreon page which lists a wide range of models that we recommend, with a lot of technical and lifestyle related information. You can find it by following the link in the description. Thank you.